Right, let's go to the beginning. Right, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Great. Right, so what I was proposing to do is try and get through this agenda in the next half an hour, maybe, and just sort of lay out a broad picture landscape for you, and then sort of pose a few of the ethical questions that arise out of this, just to sort of plant the seeds in your mind. And then I thought we could have a discussion around both what's being presented and also some of the ethical questions around it, because as you will see, there are lots of them, and many of them are new and pressing ones that arise out of the possibilities of new technology and medicine as it evolves. But of course, when myself and Ryan agreed to do this, it was before the pandemic hit, and of course healthcare has come front and center stage. So I thought I'd just start off by doing a little bit of a distinction between what the sort of two types of disease that healthcare systems usually focus on. One is acute, which is usually it means either an injury or an infection or a particular incident that can be treated and hopefully will either be healed, people go back to normal, or in the worst case, people die. And of course, the pandemic is a huge sort of manifestation of that, which is dominating everyone's thoughts at the moment. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But the biggest bulk of disease that healthcare systems are facing and dealing with on an ongoing basis, and will continue to deal with once and if this pandemic subsides, is the huge burden of chronic disease. And what I'm going to outline to you today is mainly looking at that bigger picture of chronic disease, although we can add the acute disease element into it, given that it's very salient. So what I'm going to do is take you through a little bit of the intro and background to the work that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to outline a little bit about the healthcare landscape, what's going on the bigger picture in health, because it's quite interesting to see the nature of the problem writ large. And as you'll see through this presentation, what I'm trying to give is the kind of meta picture, the big picture of healthcare in its biggest sense. And as we go through this, there are tons of detail underneath this, which we won't have time to go through today, but more than willing to pick up with anyone if they're interested in any elements of this. So we're going to go on a massive journey, if you like, across what's coming in terms of the future and new forms of health and technology that are going to completely revolutionize how we think about health. It's going to put into our hands incredible power, and how do we think about using that new power in ways that engender human and societal well-being and flourishing. Should that be a goal? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a report that I was involved in authoring, which was commissioned by the Royal Free Charity, which really led to this piece of work and is now being widely shared as a kind of provocation. In that, we explore these futures and start to think about how might the solutioning side of that look. So what could holistic health and an integrated healthcare system look like that can take advantage of all these emerging technologies? And then we'll finish up with some societal and ethical questions that arise out of this. And so what I'm presenting to you is not the answers to everything, it's a shape of the direction that we could go with healthcare if we put the person at the center, but there's a whole range of questions that arise out of that that remain to be debated and discussed, and then we could hopefully do some of that on today's session. So I'll start off by talking about the chronic disease challenge, which is, as you'll see from this slide, healthcare is almost 10% of the British GDP, or gross domestic product, or 20% of all government spend, and is rising on average around 4% per year, even if we don't do anything around new technologies, largely for three major reasons. One is more people are getting sick with chronic diseases. Obesity, diabetes are the familiar ones, but mental health is, as we know, a big one as well. We have been getting older. There's some interesting figures come out recently that life expectancy might have peaked It's grown tremendously in the last century, from a sort of average of 45 years up to kind of 85, 87. So we've done a good job up to now, and most people are going to be living longer. So that means more healthcare provided for people who are living longer. And of course, there are new medical technologies and treatments coming along that we didn't have before that would need to be paid for. So doing nothing means that we're on an upward curve, and in times of austerity, which we've been in, there's a lot of largesse going on at the moment to kind of save the economy, and we may be in for another bout of austerity after that. But this ever increasing acceleration in costs of a healthcare system are ones that represent a sort of systemic challenge that everyone's worried about, why the NHS is always complaining with lack of money. So what causes all this ill health? It's really interesting. There's lots of studies done. This is one from the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. It paints some interesting pictures, all the other studies do, which show that healthcare itself, the ability for the healthcare system to support you well, is 25% contributory to your early mortality or not. But there are other factors as well. Your genetics obviously plays a key role in that, your predisposition to get diseases. The environmental context that you're in, whether you're suffering from pollution and living in damp, horrible places, all those kinds of things can impact your health and lead you to die earlier. But the 50%, the biggest factor, are the social determinants of health. So as we'll explore a little bit in this session, where you live, the access to healthy relationships, jobs, financial security, all of these other factors of life play a huge role in early death and ill health. And if we look at the healthiest parts of the country and the sickest parts of the country, and there are parts in the southeast that have higher life expectancy, and up in the northwest there's some hotspots there that have the lowest. There's almost 20 years difference in life expectancy, and that's nothing to do with your genetics or your healthcare. That's to do with the social determinants. So this is a huge factor that needs to be thought through. So given that, what do we actually mean by health? Is it the absence of sickness, which is the kind of clinical way of thinking about health, or is it something more than that? And the World Health Organization is really trying to push a much broader, deeper definition of health, which is not the glass half empty, you're not sick, but the glass half full. So they describe it as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. So already we're starting to see at international level an attempt to reframe what we mean by health to not just treating sickness, but empowering and encouraging, if you like, wellness, which broadens what we mean by health quite dramatically from what our current healthcare system does. So let's bear that in mind. So what are the kind of complications and opportunities to kind of advance that agenda if we were to think about this more holistically? Well, one thing is for sure, and any of you who are into technology will, or even just been reading about it, or even watching some of the future movies, etc., will realize that we stand at the dawn of the greatest breakthroughs in science and medicine in human history. In the last decade, we've seen the rise of smartphones and social media and all sorts of technologies that have radically changed our life. If we move forward to the next 10 or 15 years, that is accelerating at some pace. So come 10 to 15 years time, we're going to have radically different and more powerful technologies that start to bring together sort of robotics and AI ability, as we'll hear in a minute, to manipulate genes, and also technology that understands, or insights that understand how we function physically and mentally. And the coming together of those worlds are going to produce a whole range of new possibilities for improving not only the treatment of disease, but also this question of wellness, which we just touched on. So interesting enough, we take a step back and go back 100,000, well, go up 100,000 foot. If we look back historically and think, well, how did people think about this question historically? Well, if we go back a couple of thousand years before we even had science, as we currently understand it, and people didn't really know what was going on inside us. There was definitely a recognition that in sort of captured in ancient wisdom, whether it's Buddhism or some of the Eastern traditions, and then into sort of Greek philosophy, if you're interested in that, there was a recognition that living in harmony with yourself, with others, and the environment, finding something that brought together the harmony of mind, body, and spirit, would lead you to a place where you're less likely to be in tension with any of those environments, which could lead to your ill health and ultimate demise. So there was, all through the wisdom traditions of old, this sense of holistic harmony was very, very powerful and was very much central to our ideas of what it is to live well, which I think is an important contribution from history, and we'll see why in a minute. What we have had since the scientific revolution and what we're now finding at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of this 21st century is a rapid development of the understanding of the science of the body. So science itself is a form of reductionism. Why is it that things behave in the way they do? Can we unpick that and unpack that and find all the causal processes right down in the body, right down into the genes, and right down in our head, right down to neurons and understanding of neuroscience. So there is, through science, a massive unpacking of the human body and the human mind to its constituent parts. And there's lots of experts and scientists working on all pieces of the human body. But that really raises a fundamental philosophical question, which is, okay, we've unpacked the body into all its component bits, but how do we bring all those bits together again? How do we do, what is the synthesis that needs to occur so all this knowledge can be made useful to me or to you in how to live our lives better, and those charged with providing care for us? How do we bring all this together? So there's a real need to, if you like, take the science that we've discovered in the last few years, and we'll continue to make great breakthroughs, and start folding that back into this sort of holistic frame that the ancient wisdom had given to us. So how do we synthesize, if you like, holistic thinking with all this atomic knowledge, and how do we bring that together? This is one of the kind of big challenges of how we as a society could take advantage of our new knowledge and put it to action to help us as individuals to live better, more flourishing lives. And what that really calls for is an account for us to understand what is it to be human. What is it to be human and flourish? Because if we can't really answer that question, how do we know we're assembling all this knowledge in ways that can contribute to individual and societal flourishing? Or are we just jamming bits together in ways that meet the bottom lines of particular health organizations, whether it be public or private sector? And as this technology and insight becomes deeper and more intimate into our body and to our minds, if we don't have an account of what it is to be human and to live well, to flourish, it's more likely that we'll assemble these pieces in ways that could do damage to our human health and well-being, as well as it could do contribute to human flourishing. So in some ways, there's a kind of meta-philosophical ethical question, is how do we bring all these pieces together around a much deeper understanding of what it is to be human? So in some ways, it's like the sciences and the humanities need to start talking to each other and coming up with an account to help us guide us through those questions. So really at a meta level, if individual and societal flourishing, as the World Health Organization are advocating, is what the goal is, what does that actually mean, and how can we ensure both the existing health systems and apps and things of today and all the new ones that are arriving tomorrow can be pulled together in a more compelling, holistic way to address this individual science of individual and societal flourishing? How do we bring all the bits, not of knowledge also, but the bits of a healthcare system? Because as anyone who's worked with it or dealt with it, it's massively fragmented. So there's a meta systems challenge of how to bring these organizations and actors together to a coherent, holistic view of how their joint action as a system could contribute to individual and societal flourishing. So this is a really interesting meta question that sits over this whole area that I think is really important. So let's dig into that a little bit more. So as mentioned, myself and my colleague, I think is on the call, Richard, were commissioned by the Royal Free Charity to almost sort of look at this question. They were very aware that as a charity sitting alongside a big hospital trust, that the organization itself was struggling to make sense of the rapidly changing environment around them. So rather than trying to sort of set a path forward in trying to think about digital transformation and stumble into the complexity, the ask was, could you look at the broad healthcare landscape and understand what these trends are, what's being done in these areas and where they're heading, and do a piece of thinking that basically rolls these trends forward 10 to 15 years, and then through a bit of systems thinking, imagine if all of these landed at scale, what could individual health and healthcare look like, and what would that mean for the systems currently known as primary care, secondary care, social care? One could even argue the food industry and other. How would those need to come together to operate in this new world? So it was a real interesting piece of long-term thinking to look into the very area we've been describing. So what would health look like for the individual? What would this mean for the future of health and care delivery? And the reason for doing this is that when thinking about how to move organizations or move industries forward, there's one way of thinking about it, which is how do we stumble forward from where we are, pretty unsure where the hell we're going? It's walking into the fog, if you like, which is traditional way strategy is often thought by organizations looking at the next 3 months, year, or 2 year. Or could this piece of work provide some kind of long-term vision or a kind of North Star, or in this metaphor here, a light from the future that can help guide all the conversations and iterations of strategy from across a multiple set of actors, so they're at least coordinated towards working to the shared direction? Could we create a shared framework for thinking about the vision and a shared language that could be shared across all the actors to facilitate working towards a long-term future? So this is the report that we did. It's called Health Beyond the Fog. It's available for free if you go to vision4health.org, where the 4 is a number, Vision for Health. So if you're interested in that, please go and have a look at that. I think you'll find it a very interesting provocation. So what came out of that piece of thinking? What did that systems thinking look like? Well, this is one probably the most important graphic, if you like, that we came out with. So having that sort of World Health Organization framing and thinking about the individual, we sort of laid out this landscape of all the things that are going to be important to think about in the future of healthcare. So we called it sort of cells to cities, the holistic determinants of health. So if you can imagine an individual as you can see them there, and if we sort of head down into the biological system, what we have at the moment is a healthcare system that largely reacts to when you rock up at the doctor's with an ache, a pain, a bump, a lump or something, where something has gone wrong at the organ level. You've felt some symptoms, something's not right. You've presented yourself into the healthcare system. They will do some tests and find out what's wrong with you. If you've got a chronic disease, they'll probably administer some drugs or treatment that largely will dampen the systems and sort of manage the disease. Very rarely does it ever cure it, and you could be on a sort of lifelong course of pills or treatments to manage that as you get sick. So what's being understood through science, and this is coming on at a pace, is that disease that occurs in the organs often has its origins right up at this end. So the work being done to understand how do genes function, because they are the sort of communications blueprint for each of us. How do they speak through the language of proteins into molecular networks within the cell and across cells into tissues? And how do those tissues then inform and affect and build the fully functioning organs? And can we understand what are the processes that start to go wrong at this level that end up in a cascading series of sort of almost like a pathological cascade of things that then arrive as disease in the organs, that we then have symptoms and then go to the doctor? So what's becoming possible increasingly is the ability to start to see what are the precursors of disease, where might disease occur through a genetic reason, and the ability to potentially even gene edit that out, like cystic fibrosis, one gene wrong, there's a potential to edit that gene and eradicate that disease. But more of the chronic diseases, are there precursors, biomolecular markers that indicate the disease is beginning right at the earliest stage? Can we detect that? And are there new forms of treatment to eradicate that before the disease even takes hold? So what's coming through from advanced medicine, which is moving on at pace, is potentially the ability to hack disease, which opens up, rather than waiting for people to get sick and then treat them, the ability to intervene, detect and intervene much earlier, and potentially even remove the possibility of you getting some of the common diseases that affect us at the moment. So this is really interesting stuff that's happening in the biological area. But there's also a lot being done around understanding neuroscience, understanding psychology, about how we make sense of ourselves, our relationship with ourselves, what motivates and drives us, what are the things that lead us to poor mental health outcomes, what are the beliefs and goals that drive our behaviors. And following out from that, what are the social determinants, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, whether it's job, finances, relationships, contexts that we find ourselves in. What are the relationship between those and our health behaviors in terms of what we eat, drink, do, that then lead to stresses on the body, which then start to cause these kind of problems to occur inside the body. So what are the relationship between our social determinants and behaviors and what's going on in the body? Important to think about, as we saw earlier, 50% of all our health outcomes are a result of that. And also the environment itself. What kinds of pollution are there? We're now thinking about smart cities. We're talking about the future of transport and driverless cars and drones and all sorts of things. So are we thinking about creating an environmental context which makes possible and likely good health? And our call to action is that we can't think of health just as something that doctors do with white coats and stethoscopes. If we're to take seriously that and take advantage of the opportunity to improve healthcare in the 21st century, we need to broaden out our understanding of all these factors and think about how those in their entirety can be managed systemically to improve individual and societal health and well-being. So why do we think that is possible in the future in a way that, although we know some of this, we've never been able to coordinate the bits up until now? Well, the interesting thing is that there are sensors and technologies appearing across that entire domain. So sensors in the body, there's some amazing stuff being done with sensors in the body to monitor what's flowing through your blood to pick up the earliest signs of cancer. There's been some announcements recently on some great breakthroughs there, and potentially even pathogens, viruses, proteins that indicate that something's starting to go wrong. So sensors in the body, monitoring all of those levels that will be producing data. Sensors on the body. We're familiar with wearables. There's interesting stuff coming around now with tattoos that could be hidden somewhere that could measure lots of physiological and behavioral stuff. There's also data pouring out from our increasingly digital lives about our relationships and financial systems, and there's data pouring out, or there will be, from smart cities, looking at how we inhabit and the quality of the environments that we obtain or existed. So if data is pouring out of all those environments, if we have a big enough ambition and a big enough frame, there's the ability to think about looking across all of that data to say, what are the factors that influence both an individual's own health and health journey through their life, and if we zoom out a little bit more and start looking at groups of populations, why is it that certain people are struggling with ill health or mental health or generally poor health? And how might we use this data to locate with understand the causal relationships much better, and be able to share that information so that various actors operating across this spectrum will now with precision understand what could be done and where to actually improve individual and societal well-being. And this really changes how we think about healthcare fundamentally and radically, and really calls for much more systemic collaboration of multiple actors around a shared understanding of the nature of the problem. So we think this is absolutely huge and really represents a radical departure from how we thought about healthcare historically. So let's dive a little bit into the data. Okay, so data, I made a claim that the data is going to be important. So EHR, or electronic health record, so whether it's a social care or electronic health record, what normally happens at the moment is that used to be on paper, it's increasingly be put on computer systems, but it's essentially a system of record. Who came in, what symptoms or issues did they present, what was the diagnosis, what is the treatment, what happened afterwards, they came back in, and it's a kind of sort of a traditional record. But in a world where data is pouring in from all those dimensions, of course, doctors, healthcare professionals, or even ourselves would be overwhelmed with all of that information. So what we did is looked around at how other industries deal with complexity, and for example, the Met Office and others do. And what they do is essentially bring multiple data together to create a simulation of the thing that they're trying to support. And we've heard it in industry, digital twins, we've called it a digital double. So we think there's a possibility that arises out of this about thinking of next generation health records as almost being a digital simulation of your own health that includes multiple levels. Goals that are important to you, lifestyle habits, the actions and behaviors, but then drills down into your physiological, biological, and perhaps genetic position to understand individually how things are functioning, and then over time how things have gone historically and how things are likely to go in the future. So it becomes almost like a predictive model that allows yourself and healthcare professionals to say, well, if I do this, what is likely to happen? So we think this could be very powerful at the point of individuals, and then if you roll this up into populations to start to see what factors have caused certain things and what factors could produce and predict things in the future. So of course, having a model is good, but how does this model become usable and actionable to ourselves, for example, or for healthcare professionals? And this is where we, in talking to some of the tech companies and just observing more generally, that the rise of virtual assistants, we've got incarnations of that today, like Alexa and Siri and all of those things, are really an attempt to bring together multiple sets of data that sit in some kind of model and bring it to life using technologies that are increasingly learning us rather than we have to learn them. And obviously the voice-based interface we're becoming more familiar with. But there's work being done on avatars and holograms. So what comes possible out of this is the potential for a digital health coach, which is essentially using this data and the knowledge of health and well-being to interpret and support you. So what might this look like in a healthcare system of the future? So this is very much abstracted up at a very high level. But essentially, and it looks a bit complex, so I won't spend too much on it, but I just want to give you a flavor of it. So on the left-hand side, you've got the individual, there's more and more data from sensors, etc., that starts to build a picture for the individual and for those trusted with their care to understand what's going on at the moment. And the ability to support people with wellness behaviors. So that could be around supporting and coaching around diet and exercise, emotional health and mental health. The episodic stuff is things that have gone wrong, you want some support from, you might pop to the doctors historically, but there might be a bunch of stuff that having information passed from your body could help the digital health coach to give you tips around that. spotting risks as soon as possible, whether they're the risky behaviors or risks represented in terms of the biomarkers that get quick interventions. If you do get long-term conditions, then how might this be more holistically managed and supported? Because today there's lots of ologists that have parallel relationships with you around their bit of your body, not a whole person frame. And then increasingly as people become more infirm through disease or old age assisted care. So a digital health coach could be supporting people around all of these elements, could be one or another, and increasingly as you get older, perhaps more of those, and providing a kind of mediation between a more integrated healthcare system, which is also sharing exactly the same data, to run and support a more holistic care for individuals. Why is the digital health coach important to think about in this? Well, all the studies have shown that even if you are sick with long-term conditions, the average person spends less than 0.01% of their time with a healthcare person, and over 99.99% by themselves. So any of the advice and care plans being driven by people in the healthcare system, that's very episodic. So how does that live with you in the context in which you're making decisions and need support? This is where the digital health coach can be, we think is a really interesting conceptual approach to taking this advice, linking it to what's going on to be able to provide people with help in context. A final thing I'll just say on this is that if there is shared understanding of individual and societal well-being, if you like, through a more integrated data insights, there's the ability not only to support a next generation integrated healthcare system marked here by the dark blue, but also the possibility, and this is where we step into ethics, the possibility to share these insights, probably anonymized, to help people like the life sciences industries to identify where there are opportunities for new treatments, to be able to ask people to be involved so that those can be developed quickly and more rapidly, to lower the cost and support sort of life sciences. Also research community, if we're going to drive insights on this information, who being the research community is important. Voluntary and third sector, at the moment, there's a little bit of a scattergun approach they have. If they can be provided with information to help to target their resources and their activities much more precisely, that could be incredibly important. So there's a real opportunity for a data-powered infrastructure to drive more collaboration, understanding, and precision-based action from all actors in a healthcare system. So we think this is systemically a really important thing. However, as we'll come on to, it raises all sorts of interesting questions around privacy. Why do all this? Well, at 100,000 foot, if you look at the costs to individuals and to society, if that's on this axis, and we look at as people get older, what typically happens is that we don't look after ourselves very well. We're at risk, but no one really knows about it. We topple into the healthcare system. We have long-term conditions that we don't look after very well, and then we fall into full-time care. The model that we just outlined, we think could help people to stay well for longer, spot risks before they become symptoms for early interventions, have much better holistic management of any conditions that do arise, and support people better to sustainable independent living. The result is the total time of life spent lived well should increase. And obviously the wheels fall off right at the end, and all of us are due to die at some point unless we solve that problem, which is another question. But if we can extend the period of time lived well for individuals, there's a better quality of life for us all, but also writ large, that potentially is a lower cost to the system, maybe addressing one of these huge challenges we've got of runaway healthcare costs. So this is the size of the prize, if you like. So I'll finish off with a few ethical questions that I'll just sort of land on you. So I've been approaching this as a systemic level. So really raises some really interesting questions, some of them quite deep and philosophical. So what would be the social contract in this new world? What would, is it around well-being and empowering people to live well? And if so, what is the role of state and society in providing and supporting people and the individual to do that themselves. What happens if this level of insight and surveillance, could the state use it to become paternalistic and sort of there'll be implications if we don't behave well? Can we think about it that way, or would it be the other way, where we're empowering individual freedom through better understanding of what's going on within me and the implications of the choices I'm making to my own health and well-being? It's where is it likely to sit across this spectrum, and how do we mitigate that? So that sort of surveillance for good, I could argue, versus surveillance for control. That's probably another way of saying the same thing. Also raises the question, if we want to build a healthcare system more like this in the future, who comes first? Is our way of thinking about a society orientated around care for people, either individual and societal flourishing, or is it the economy comes first and we actually care about the money, and that we will limit what we provide to people? Should this be public health versus private health delivery, or certainly some collaboration at some scale be required, because the public health systems don't have the technologies that are required to do this? So is it collaboration? What form? And what about inequalities? One of the things we know is that private sector is unlikely to spend large amounts of money in groups of people that can't, where there's no money to be made. And would we create further inequalities through this kind of approach? And should the state and society be thinking in these long-term visioning ways, with a long-term vision and ambition to kind of pull collective action towards this? Or should they stay in what we would argue and provoke as a much more short-term management mindset, which is kind of nudging all the silos to do a little bit more, but not really having anything systemic to create a paradigm shift in how we think about our healthcare, which we argue in this report is absolutely key. Individual and societal flourishing. Who and to what degree is the responsibility for my health mine or ours, or is it the community, or is it the state? Where does that new line lie? Where does I begin and the state finish, if there's sensors in my body and on my body? Interesting question. What the context for health? So it's not just about the decisions I make, but as we've seen through the earlier slides on social determinants, there is a role and responsibility for actors to provide the context that make good health possible, which is why we have such poor health in some of the disadvantaged communities. And you know, it's not just food, but food companies are interested. Over 50% of all food consumed in the UK is processed food. We know that there's harmful elements within processed food. At the moment, we think, oh, the market is the most important thing, but that's contributing to massive societal obesity and ill health. So how do we grapple with those questions? Interesting. Welfare. People get snarled up in the safety net, which is one of the aspects of the net metaphor. Should we be seeing it as a safety trampoline? Should we be thinking about how we help people spring back into life rather than getting stuck in welfare? Or is welfare part of how we live in the future? Big questions. Oops. And then just finishing off then, life sciences and pharma. We know there's big questions around aligning their incentives to create and help societal wellness and prevention, rather than having business models that only make sense for them by maintaining sickness. I'm being a little bit radical here, but I'm making the point. And of course, the genetics. What are the limits of what we should be doing there? There's lots of ethical questions, especially if we edit genes that then get passed down to future generations. That's a big existential question around that. And then finally, we touched on who owns the data in this incredibly data-rich world. Do we want that data captured? Who owns it? Who interprets it? Who do we share it with? And if we do share it, what are the value of privacy versus the shared knowledge that we all have of understanding what's going on to create a better healthcare system of the future? So just a few points to leave you with there. I've realized in my excitement to tell you all about this, I've gone over a little bit the half an hour, but I'll stop there and invite people for questions. I don't know, Ryan, if there's people who entered questions into the chat that you want to surface or invite people to kind of speak to those, but I'm ready for questions.
Thanks very much, Andy. You've both blown my mind and given me visions of the future, and simultaneously made me worried about all the things that might be killing me right now.
I do have a question, unless they are the chat ones, maybe first.
Yeah, there's been a lot of activity on the chat, actually. Maybe we can try and work through the chat forwards. So if we start with VJ, asked whether the presentations can be shared afterwards.
Yes, happy to share that. So I'll send it to you and you can distribute it. Yeah.
So Ryan, I was thinking also, because you know, we had quite a lot of conversation, and I think some of the questions that were asked earlier in the session, some were actually answered and some weren't.
Okay.
But maybe why don't we go in order? You know, first VJ, then Piero, then Shari, and then each of them can share one question from all of the ones that they shared, because I'm sure that there's so many questions. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay. Yeah. So Piero, you get to pick a question, basically.
Yeah. So hi. So in the first slide about the Canadian healthcare, you said 50% was socioeconomic. So I mean, as you kind of pointed out, for me, those kind of large scale statistics are problematic, right? Because as you yourself pointed out, it's quite complicated. Yeah. So there must be some way to further break that down in my mind, because it seems to me like it's not measurable, it's not actionable. So when we talk about socioeconomic, what specifically are we talking about? And I think that's kind of as a root cause for you know, health or ill health. I think that's quite an important thing that I'd like to understand. That's my question.
Yes, it is a big topic, so I couldn't really do justice to it on this call, but I'll just point out some things in it. So it's understood that from a socioeconomic point of view, if you're looking at sort of disadvantaged communities where these social determinants seem to be most at play, that when people are faced with, say for example, difficult financial situations, there's a degree of anxiety that arises out of potentially not being able to pay the bills, feed the kids. Social anxiety tends to reduce our ability to think clearly in our own interests. So there's a tendency where people's horizons shrink and they start to just do what they need to do next. So things like food choices, taking loans from loan sharks, all these kind of behaviors flow out that then start to lead to people being in quite desperate situations, making often quite poor choices around their health behaviors in terms of their eating. There's a strong correlation with people self-medicating their stress through things like alcohol and snacking unhealthy foods. All of these cascading set of interlinked problems then become ingrained habits of behavior of dealing with their plight and their situation, which are heavily correlated to the onset of chronic diseases. So in some ways there's an unpicking of those and understanding their interrelationship and thinking about where, from a policy or from an intervention point for particular communities, where would be the greatest point of intervention that can have the greatest impact. At the moment, there's a sense that there's problems in there. It's not well understood, the interrelationship of those things, and there are various actors working in a completely uncoordinated way trying to address pieces of that problem. And the net result is, to this moment, we haven't done a very good job on that, and we're getting almost growing health inequalities. So there's a real systems need to understand all the many more of the factors and how they interrelate, but it's around diet and exercise and alcohol and all of those kinds of things which are linked to people's jobs, their security, their relationships, their financial situation. I hope that helps a little bit. I mean, I could go on about that a lot more, but I was just trying to give you a sort of high level flavor of what lies underneath that particular area.
It's very useful. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add to that, that actually it seems that the most pervasive and clearest connection in terms of health inequalities is between poverty and income inequality and health. So it's poverty and income inequality, and a lot of other inequalities derive from poverty and income inequality. So a lot of the other inequalities, such as alcohol use, adverse childhood experiences, housing status, housing quality, environmental factors, even relationships and issues of domestic violence and the rest derive from if you are poorer or if you are more economically unequal in status compared to others in your society, then you will have worse health.
Sorry, can I add just on that too? Just one thing, that in this case, this might be true, I'm not an expert, but this preventive medicine approach, which was described in the talk, is gonna, if not, in my view, I might be completely wrong, but it's gonna increase that. The preventive medicine, because it just, all this health coach and sensors and all this amazing thing that you described, first of all, they're probably not going to be available for the poor, and they really impact the freedom of people. I think the healthcare system of the future should be an healthcare system that put a lot of resources into treating the sick, into find the best way to treat the sick, and also doing some preventive stuff, but not invasive preventive stuff. The focus should be on treating who is sick, not who is not sick. I think that's my opinion in that. If we want to, for everybody, of course, to address also the poor.
Yes. Obviously, treating the sick is important. When certainly in this future, we would never advocate that people stop treating the sick, and then we need to get better at treating the sick. And the sick tend to congregate out of the disadvantaged communities for the reasons we've just been talking about. But if we're going to improve the health and well-being of the population writ large, waiting for people to become sick, it can't be the answer. So we've got to do a lot more around the prevention side. And one of the benefits of prevention is there will be less sick people. So getting to understand what are these upstream social determinants and what are the ways that we can shine a light to understand how people fall into patterns of behavior that lead to poor health, what could be done structurally to improve the context that people find themselves in. I think this has to be part of how we think about health and care in the 21st century. Now, the interesting thing about technology is that, and I'm going to sort of caricature it here, but developing the digital health coach is going to be quite a complex set of developments and algorithms, and there's going to be a lot of work to evolve something that could fully function in that form. But once you've developed it once, the interesting thing about operating in the digital world is that you could replicate that 60 million times at hardly any cost. It's not like
I'm not gonna. Sorry, I want to.
Million.
I have so much to say, so I'm gonna keep. Yeah. I don't want to monopolize, so I'm gonna give some space to all people that have questions.
let's go around on questions. And I think Giovanni, you also had a question. So I think maybe I've seen that David and
that was my question. So.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. And then let's come back as well. I think we'll do rounds. But I think David Wood has also been, making quite a lot of comments on the chat. So David, do you want to, choose, I guess, your favorite question so far and pose it either for Andy or for discussion?
Thanks. So to pick one question, who is going to own this digital coach? We can all see that in principle it could be very useful. Is it going to be owned and developed by pharmaceutical companies, by insurance companies, by high-tech companies like Google? Or is it possible, in some sense, it really could be owned by the people for the people? because as much as we love our social media companies and all spend lots of time on them, we're all aware that they're not necessarily motivated really by the public good, and they are often motivated instead by that nasty word, two-edged word, profit.
Very good question, David, and something we've thought quite a bit about, but again, the purpose of our work is to surface issues to have exactly this kind of conversation. And clearly, in its current form, the public health system does not have the technology capability or wherewithal to build something like this. The private sector, Silicon Valley, is steaming ahead trying to build these kind of capabilities for other aspects of our life. And one could argue they're even parking their tanks on the health and well-being lawn. And if the public healthcare system was to sit back and just sit back in its clinics and in its hospitals to do healthcare as it's done from the legacy perspective, it's highly likely that Google and others will move in and colonize this space and essentially disintermediate public healthcare, because they will have access to sensors, knowledge about you, and provide you with better healthcare advice than your GP or your doctor. So there is a risk that the richer elements of society could be peeled off, and we'd end up having a two-tier healthcare system by virtue of the fact that the private sector is moving in. However, one of the things we thought about quite a lot when we were thinking about this future is what, not only there's a lot of data, and it was a question of who owns the data, but almost like a question that arises that becomes more important is that who interprets the data? Because if this data is about your biochemical status, most of the population will have no clue what that data means. So who interprets the data, who owns the digital health coach, if you like, is going to have massive power to influence people's behaviors and shape their actions and possibly even their purchasing behaviors if there's suggestions about doing something or buying something. And there you get right to this question that you raised there about, are the incentives of the entity providing the health coach aligned with my personal health and well-being? Because if there's a mismatch, i.e., I want to use this data to convince you to do something so I can make money out of you, then there's huge scope for misbehavior, because the individual will not understand the full import and extent of the information and what it means. So you're reliant on the interpreter to guide you, which if they have a different economic incentive could lead to a mismatch. So it then feels, should it be the state leading this, but supported by technology company? But then you've got the question of, is the state someone you would also trust with having the information? Because although they might not try and get you to buy stuff, they might be surveilling you in ways that could cause anxiety. So I think your point is well made. Is there a third way? Is it owned in trust by the people, for the people, designed by the people, run by the people, as an independent social entity whose role is to support us each and individually as part of a almost run by the commons, if you like? So I think these are really interesting areas to explore and to dig deep into, because the issues of trust and incentives, I think, lie around, but it's an incredibly powerful piece of infrastructure that to gaze into our lives and provide us an advice. So is it working on our individual societal flourishing? Is that the driving energy and towards its action, or is it supporting other agendas? And how do we think about creating the institution that can hold that in a way that we're all comfortable with? I think it's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think Rina is going to make a question or a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually say, I feel that we're losing the person-centered value and the meaning, to be honest, and that's kind of becoming more eradicated, and we're looking at this maybe like digital form, and it'd be just great to see, more, I guess, help people being catered to from how they used to be from long ago back in the day. And I don't feel connected to the new era that we are going in. I mean, you know, I'm young myself. I know there's loads of like technology all around me, but I completely I don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm. So just conscious of time, just want to give a quick heads up. So maybe Andy, if you want to, you know, maybe share your thoughts on this, and then maybe
sorry, can I just make a brief comment, because I really haven't had a chance to comment. I know there isn't much time.
Just conscious, we're almost out of time. So Rena just made a comment. Maybe Shari, if you can make a quick comment, and then Andy, if you can just say some closing words, and then we'll be able to provide some points. So yeah, Shari, if you want to give we have only a couple of minutes left, but yeah, please share your thoughts.
Thanks. In a word, I see a real incongruity between the thrust of the beginning of the presentation, which is around systemic health, and the end result, which is an individualized app or kind of mechanism for me as an individual to have some kind of digital health coach. I think it would be much better if that was conceived systemically. So it shouldn't be a digital health coach, some individualized thing to help me, but it should be like a digital health support system. And it should be very much feeding into government, because as you rightly pointed out, Andy, a lot of the impacts on my individual health are structural that government needs to fix. Yeah. That was the point that I wanted to make.
Awesome. Okay, so and just I guess before passing, I'm also conscious that VJ has been quite active on the chat. VJ, I don't know if you have a 20-second either point or question that you want to share. Otherwise, I'll just hand it over to Andy to wrap up. Yeah, it seems there's not. But yeah, there's been some interesting discussions. So please do read the chat. So yeah, over to you, Andy. Maybe let's just give some wrap-up words, because this has been a fantastic presentation so far. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Rena and Shari, your points are well made, and I appreciate covering such a broad landscape. I've gone a bit thin on some of the areas that that probably warranted further depth. So the importance of the personal relationship within health, I think, is incredibly important. And one of the critiques of doctors and healthcare workers at the moment, it's not their fault, is that they spend an inordinate amount of time feeding their computer systems with all sorts of stuff that they need to do in any consultation, which means there's a limited amount of time for the person-to-person element of healthcare. So what we're advocating really is that the information that flows out of these systems is able to support individuals in the context of when they're by themselves, but also is shared information with healthcare practitioners, so that the doctors and healthcare professionals, as the chief executive of the Royal Free said, can focus on the art of medicine, the person-to-person element, because the science of medicine's already, a lot of that's being done behind the scenes. So there's the benefits of this information insight are to further enrich the quality of the conversations between healthcare professionals and the individual. So we're not saying this is removing healthcare professionals and that importance, but helping individuals by themselves and enriching the conversations that healthcare professionals can have. I think to Shari's point, one of the things that perhaps I didn't do such a good job then is in that three pillar slide. Although the digital health coach is a constant companion to support individuals, what I was trying to advocate there is that the total data that arises out of these is being shared with institutions who can then have a better understanding of what's going on in populations and communities, such that governments, local governments, healthcare actors, in some ways health percolates many different industries. There's a much greater understanding of where the issues are and how we might collectively take group action to improve the context of people who are suffering at the moment. So it's both structural and individual combined in harmony. That's what we see as being the most powerful way of thinking about this. So thanks everyone for participating in this. As I said, vision4health.org, myself and Richard, the co-author, have are in the process of pulling together a not-for-profit, because we feel this is such an important question. In some ways, the coronavirus crisis has shone a light on the fact that we don't have a systemic healthcare system able to move at pace to address some of our challenges, and they're doing a fantastic job at the moment. But I think the focus will be on the future. How do we mobilize and think about health of our people in a more systemic way? And we think the work that we've done is a valuable piece of shining the light on that future, to create a language and hopefully provoke healthcare leaders, politicians, leaders of life sciences companies, etc., to lift their snouts out of the trough of the everyday, to come together around a shared view of the future that can involve us as people as well, because there are many ethical questions that arise out of this. And creating a techno-determinist future can't be the way forward. We will have the power of gods in the future, but we need the wisdom and love of gods to be able to apply that and bring it together in a way that's to our individual and societal benefit. And that's the conversation we'd love to provoke. So if anyone here wants to keep being involved, get involved, support us, contribute to the discussion, we'd welcome your thoughts and feedback.
That's awesome. Thanks very much, Andy. I'm very sorry that we've not been able to fit more of the discussion into this session. It seems like there's plenty of momentum here, and related discussion that we could do in another session if you'd be interested.
I'm open for a follow-up session if people want us to go deeper on some of these themes. We've just kind of opened Pandora's box a bit and had a little bit of a glimpse inside, but there's a lot more there to talk about.
It'd certainly be interesting collaborating with you, David, as well, if you were interested in. Since I knew you run a rather famous group.
Yeah, I run London Futurist, and I'd love to have more discussions on this point. I haven't got anything in the book yet for a future meeting, but I'm waiting to hear back from 2 or 3 possible speakers soon. So you're all welcome to check out London Futurists online. And thanks for the discussion today. It's been rich.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Yeah, so as it stands, our next session is due to be in a month's time, where we're going to be looking at the topic of climate change, and more specifically on what business can do about climate change, and new approaches to using technology for carbon accounting and tracking. That's due for in a month's time, but if we do come up with a way to grab Andy again, then we'll send out a message. Cool.
Great.
So,
thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a good Friday.
Thank you.
See you in a bit.